Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what happens when an entire nation turns its back on God? What does it look like when truth is traded for comfort and idols take the place of faith? And what if God's response wasn't a government, not a revolution, but just one man, alone, unarmed, unknown? This isn't folklore. This isn't fiction. This is real. The story of Elijah, the prophet who walked into the palace of a corrupt king and declared, "It will not rain until I say so." Before he ever called down fire from heaven, before he rode into eternity on a chariot of flames, Elijah was just one person, standing against a broken culture, listening for the voice of God. His journey began in the shadows, in silence, in drought. So the question is, what does faith look like when everything around you has forgotten God? Let's take a journey back to a time when the rain stopped and one man's obedience changed everything. Let's dive in. 3. The calling of Elijah. When one voice stands alone. Sometimes God doesn't start with a crowd. He starts with one. No title, no big speech, no social media following. Just one person willing to speak up when nobody else will. That's Elijah. He came out of nowhere, literally. No one knew much about him. No fancy background, no religious position, no family legacy. Just a man from a small town called Tishbe. But God called him to walk right up to the most powerful man in Israel, King Ahab, and say something that would change everything. As surely as the Lord lives, the God I serve, there will be no rain, not even dew, until I say so. That's it. One sentence. No lightning from heaven. No mic drop moment. He said it, then left. But that one line shut down the sky. No rain, no crops, no comfort, just silence. Why? Because sometimes silence speaks louder than thunder. Here's what's crazy about this. Elijah had zero credentials. He didn't come from a big temple. He wasn't a priest or a prophet's son, but he had something better: obedience. And that's what God looks for. Not clout, not charisma, just someone who's willing. That same thing happens today. You don't need to be famous or ordained to stand for truth. You don't need to have a Bible degree to say, this isn't right. You don't need a platform to make an impact. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to go first. There's a woman I met. She works in finance, right in the heart of NYC. Her office is cutthroat, high pressure, all about numbers. Faith? Not exactly trending there. But when a coworker's dad got sick, she quietly offered to pray. No big moment, no spotlight. 2 weeks later, that coworker pulled her aside and said, "I don't know what you believe, but whatever it is, I need it." That's what obedience looks like. Not loud, just faithful. Too often, we think only pastors or church leaders can really follow God. But that's a lie. God uses regular people, quiet people, scared people. He used Elijah, and he can use you, because let's be real. Sometimes standing for God means standing alone, and that's hard. But God doesn't need an army to start a movement. He just needs a yes. That's what Elijah gave him. He didn't try to fit in. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't water it down. He just spoke the truth and left the rest to God. And guess what? That truth shook the nation. But here's the thing about obedience. 2. Baalism rebranded, idols in the age of success. Let me ask you something. What if the thing pulling you away from God doesn't look evil at all? What if it looks like progress? Back in Elijah's time, Baal wasn't just some statue people bowed to out of fear. He was the God of results, the God of rain, the God of crops, cash, and comfort. He worked. If you were a farmer, Baal was your guy. If you needed your land to produce, your business to grow, or your family to eat, you didn't have time to wait for miracles. You wanted results. So Israel, God's chosen people, did what we still do today. They looked for the quickest return. They stopped trusting God and started trusting what seemed to work. And that's how compromise always starts. Not with rebellion, but with convenience. They didn't stop believing in God. They just stopped waiting on Him. Now fast forward to our world. We don't have statues named Baal anymore, but we do have idols. And they're everywhere. They show up in our calendars, our goals, our bank accounts. We chase hustle. We glorify busy. We sacrifice peace for performance and call it success. Ever hear someone say, "I'm just grinding for the future"? That's our modern Baal talking. I once met a guy who had it all. CEO title, Tesla in the driveway, picture-perfect resume, but at what cost? He hadn't had dinner with his family in weeks. His teenage son barely spoke to him. His marriage quietly falling apart. He said something I'll never forget. "I didn't mean to lose everything. I just got really good at chasing the wrong thing." That's the danger. Baal never comes as a threat. He comes as a shortcut. He offers success now, no surrender needed. And if we're honest, we've all been tempted. It's easy to think, if it's working, it must be right. If it's making me money, it must be a blessing. If it's getting me ahead, God must be in it. But here's the truth. Not every open door is from God. Not every win is worth the trade. Not every blessing is actually a gift. Some things come at the cost of your peace, your purpose, or your people. And here's where it gets real. Success isn't bad. Hard work isn't bad. Goals aren't bad. But when they become your God, when they define your worth, when they steal your time, your soul, your connection to God and others, they're not blessings, they're bondage. Israel didn't see it until it was too late. They were still showing up to temple on Sabbath, but their hearts were loyal to Baal because Baal was giving them what they wanted, fast. And that's when Elijah stepped in, not to just tear down a false god, but to call out the lie behind him, that the source of your provision is what you worship, that success without surrender isn't success, it's a setup. Elijah's first message wasn't fire, it was silence. No rain, no growth, no results. Because sometimes God has to stop everything just to show us who we're really depending on. So let me ask you, what's the Baal in your life? What's the thing you're trusting more than God? Coming up next, Elijah makes his move, and the skies shut down. When the rain stops, judgment announced. 1. When power corrupts belief, the fall of a nation. What happens when those in power stop fearing God? In the days of ancient Israel, the people weren't just turning away from their faith. They were being led there by their king. His name was Ahab. He was the most powerful man in the land sitting on the throne of Israel. But instead of using his influence to point people to the God of Abraham, he used it to lead them astray. And it wasn't by accident. Ahab married Jezebel, a foreign princess who worshipped Baal, one of the most infamous false gods in history. Baal was believed to control storms, rain, and fertility. He was marketed as the source of success, prosperity, and the future. With Jezebel came not only a different culture, but a new religion, one that demanded Israel forget their past, abandon their covenant with God, and bow to a carved image. Ahab didn't just allow it, he built altars for Baal. He promoted it. He made it law. Now, this wasn't just a king choosing a different god. It was a complete rebranding of Israel's identity, from a nation led by faith to a nation ruled by politics, power, and performance. Sound familiar? Today, we don't bow to statues, but we still build altars to career, to fame, to comfort, to control. In modern America, many leaders across media, politics, and education no longer appeal to God for guidance. They appeal to data, to polls, to feelings. We remove prayer from schools, then ask why kids are hopeless. We preach tolerance in public, but mock faith in private. We celebrate self as the highest truth and dismiss the idea of sin as outdated. Like ancient Israel, we've allowed power and influence to redefine what's right and wrong. And here's the scary part. Ahab didn't try to erase God. He just replaced him with something more convenient. Baal wasn't terrifying. He was persuasive. He offered rain. He promised results. And isn't that what we want too? We chase what works, not always what's true. We follow what gives us comfort, not what shapes our character. A nation can look like it's thriving on the outside, booming economy, strong institutions, cultural influence, but be completely empty on the inside. That was Israel under Ahab. They had political strength, they had military force, they had wealth, but they had no soul, and that made them weak in the ways that mattered most. Let me pause here for a moment and speak heart to heart. Falling away from God doesn't always look like chaos. It often looks like slow, subtle compromise. We stop reading His Word. We stop praying. We start tolerating what we once called sin. We blend in with the culture around us. And before we even realize it, We've built temples to Baal in our own hearts. Israel didn't fall in a day. It happened over time because faith was no longer anchored in truth. It was anchored in power. That's the world Elijah was born into. That's the moment he stepped into, alone. He didn't walk into revival, he walked into silence. But sometimes, silence is where God starts speaking, because when nations forget God, he often sends one voice, one person, to remind the world who's still in control. So let's follow that voice. Let's see what happens next as Elijah, an unknown prophet, takes his first step into a land that no longer fears the Lord. Sometimes after you speak up, God takes you into hiding, not as a punishment, but as preparation, because before the fire from heaven, there's the waiting, the quiet, the wilderness. We'll talk about that next. So if you've ever felt small, overlooked, unqualified, you're in good company. Elijah was all of that, and still, God used him to change history. In the quiet, when God provides in unexpected places. 4. Judgment declared. When rain stops, what remains? It didn't come with fire from the sky. No thunder, no dramatic explosion. It came with something much quieter. No rain, just silence. Sky after sky, empty. After Elijah stood before King Ahab and spoke those bold words, "There will be no rain or dew unless I say so," he vanished from the public eye. And then the rain stopped, not just for a few days, for years. At first, maybe people thought it was just a dry season. We've seen this before. They probably said, "It'll pass." But it didn't. The crops failed. The rivers shrank. The animals grew weak. Families struggled to survive. And one day, it hit them. This wasn't just a weather problem. This was a God problem. Here's the part that gets me. God didn't strike them with lightning. He didn't send a plague or an earthquake. He just removed the one thing they had stopped thanking him for: rain. Sometimes the judgment of God isn't loud. It's quiet. It's subtle. It's the slow unraveling of everything we thought we could count on. And I think we're seeing that today. Our world is filled with pressure, burnout, mental health struggles, division, confusion, climate disasters, inflation, families breaking down, faith fading into the background. And maybe some of that is just part of life in a broken world. But maybe, just maybe, some of it is the rain stopping. Not because God is cruel, but because we've been ignoring his voice for too long. Sometimes the drought isn't in the soil, it's in the soul. We've built our lives on success, performance, image, convenience, and now we're realizing it doesn't hold up when things go dry. The truth is, God doesn't always shout. Sometimes he just stops talking, not because he's done with us, but because he's waiting for us to wake up, waiting for us to return. It's like when a parent says, "Okay, you don't want to listen, then I'll let you see where that road leads." Not to punish, but to teach. That's what was happening in Israel. Elijah didn't curse the land. He warned them. And when they ignored the warning, the rain stopped. So here's the question we all need to ask. What's drying up in my life? Is it my peace, my purpose, my joy, my connection to God? If so, maybe it's not random. Maybe it's not just a rough season. Maybe it's God's way of saying, "Come back to me," because even in judgment, God's heart is mercy. Even when the rain stops, he's still good, still present, still inviting us to return. And while the nation was feeling the drought, God was quietly taking care of Elijah, away from the spotlight, far from the noise, in the most unexpected place. And that's where we're heading next, because sometimes when everything else is drying up, God starts pouring out, just not where you expect. In the quiet, when God provides in unexpected places. 5. Hidden for a purpose. The brook of preparation. After Elijah dropped that truth bomb on King Ahab, telling him there'd be no rain until he said so, you'd expect something big to happen next, right? Like a national revival, a viral moment, maybe a big God showed up scene. But nope. God told Elijah to disappear. "Go east and hide near the Kerith Brook. You'll drink from the stream. And I've commanded some ravens to bring you food." Seriously? From the palace to a canyon? From speaking truth to hiding out and eating room service from birds? Doesn't sound like the glamorous life of a prophet. But here's the thing. God often pulls us into quiet places, not to punish us, but to prepare us. Elijah wasn't being benched. He was being trained. He'd just stood before a king. Soon he'd face down hundreds of false prophets. But right now, he needed to learn how to depend on God. One meal, one day at a time. Let's talk real life for a second. You ever been in a season where it felt like nothing was happening, where you're stuck in a job that feels like it's going nowhere, or you're home, watching other people shine while you feel forgotten? That's the brook. It's that quiet season, the no spotlight zone. And it's easy to think, if I'm not doing something big, I must not matter. But that's not true. Look throughout Scripture. God has a habit of using the wilderness to shape world changers. David was in the fields before he fought Goliath. Moses wandered the desert for years before leading Israel. Even Jesus spent 30 years in obscurity before stepping into ministry. Why? Because character gets built in the quiet. Trust gets tested when no one's watching. Faith gets real when the only thing you have is God. Elijah learned that lesson by a stream. No stage, no audience, just him, a brook, and some birds dropping off breakfast. And you know what? God showed up every single day. I once met a guy who was between jobs. He was smart, talented, but nothing was clicking. He felt useless. But during that time, he started waking up early, reading his Bible, volunteering behind the scenes. A year later, out of nowhere, he landed a position that had way more impact than he ever expected. And guess what? He was ready because of the quiet season. That's what the brook does. It doesn't make you famous, it makes you faithful. So if you feel like you're in a holding pattern right now, like you're hidden, forgotten, on pause, don't miss this. God sees you, and He's doing something in you, even if no one else notices. You don't have to be out front to be in God's will. You don't need applause to have purpose. Sometimes the most important work is what God does in us when no one's watching. Elijah's time at the brook wasn't wasted. It was sacred, because what's coming next would require a kind of faith and focus that only the quiet could teach. But God wasn't done teaching yet. Next, Elijah wouldn't be alone. He'd meet someone on the edge of survival in a town hit hard by the drought, and together their faith would be tested in a whole new way. A widow's faith, miracles in rock-bottom places. 6. Scarcity meets surrender, the widow's test of faith. Okay, picture this. You're a single mom. You've lost your husband. You've got one child to feed, and there's nothing left in the pantry but a scoop of flour and a splash of oil. You're down to your last meal, literally. You're out gathering sticks, not for a cozy fire, but to bake bread so you and your son can eat and then die. That's when Elijah walks into your life, a complete stranger, a man of God, sure, but you've never seen him before. And what does he say? Hey, could you bring me some water? Oh, and while you're at it, how about a piece of bread too? You stop in your tracks. Is this guy serious? You tell him the truth. I've got nothing. Just enough to make one final meal for me and my boy. That's it. But Elijah doesn't flinch. He says, don't be afraid. Make me a small loaf first, then go and make something for you and your son. Because God promises, your flour and oil won't run out until the rain comes again. And right there, you're faced with the biggest decision of your life. Do you trust a man you just met? Do you give up your last bite of food? Do you believe that maybe, just maybe, God is about to show up? Now pause with me here. This isn't just a Bible story. This is life, because haven't we all been there? At the end of our rope, bank account near zero, energy drained, faith running low, and then comes that quiet whisper in your heart, give anyway, trust anyway, serve anyway. It doesn't make sense. It never does. But that's where faith lives, not in abundance, but in scarcity. We don't grow faith when everything's easy. We grow it when we're not sure how we'll make it through the week. And we trust God anyway. You know, I once heard about a retired couple who were barely scraping by. Their medical bills were piling up. Their savings were gone. And yet, every Thursday, they cooked an extra meal for the homeless guy who slept near the train station. They didn't do it for recognition. They didn't even tell anyone. They just felt like it was what God was asking them to do. And somehow, even when they didn't know how they'd cover the light bill, they always had enough. Just like the widow. Because here's the truth. The miracle didn't happen before she gave. It happened after. God didn't promise her full barns. He promised daily provision. one jar, one day, one act of faith at a time. And that's how it works for us too. We often say, I'll be generous when I have more. I'll serve when I have time. I'll trust when life gets easier. But that's not faith. That's convenience. Real faith says, I don't have much, but I'll give you what I've got. And somehow, God makes it enough. So if you're in a place right now where you feel stretched thin, financially, emotionally, spiritually, don't underestimate what God can do with your little. Because when we surrender what's in our hands, He multiplies it in ways we could never predict. The widow gave a small piece of bread. God gave her months of provision. And Elijah, he wasn't just fed. He witnessed firsthand how bold faith, especially from someone with nothing, can shake heaven. But the story doesn't end there, because just when everything seems to be going right, tragedy strikes again. The widow's son falls ill and dies. And now Elijah's faith will be tested in a whole new way. When faith is shaken, the first resurrection. 7. The never-empty jar, a lesson in daily dependence. Let me paint you a picture. Every morning, this widow gets up probably still tired, still worried, but she heads to the same little jar on the shelf. Scoop, still flour. Then she tips the jug. Still oil. It's not overflowing. She's not swimming in abundance, but it's there every single day. And that's a miracle, because back then, there was no rain, no crops, no harvest. The land was dry and broken, but inside this humble little home, God showed up, and He did it in the most unflashy, quiet, consistent way. He kept her fed. Let's be real for a second. Most of us would rather have God drop a full pantry on us, fill our fridges for a year, give us the kind of financial peace where we never have to worry again. We want security, control, a 5-year plan with a safety net. But that's not what God gave this woman. He didn't give her a stockpile. He gave her just enough every single day. Why? Because sometimes God's goal isn't to make us rich, it's to make us trust. Think about it. In our American culture, we're taught from day one to be self-reliant. Build your savings. Max out your 401k. Have a backup for your backup. And sure, being wise with money is good, but there's a line. There's a difference between wisdom and worship. And a lot of us cross it without even realizing. We say we trust God, but deep down, we're leaning hard on our income, our investments, our career path. We feel safe when we're in control. But what happens when control slips? What happens when the job disappears, or the economy crashes, or the plan falls apart? That's when daily dependence becomes real. Let me tell you about a guy named Mark. He was a graphic designer, super talented, great career, nice apartment in Chicago. But during COVID, his agency downsized, and he got laid off. Suddenly, rent wasn't so easy. Groceries weren't guaranteed. He had no family nearby, no spouse, no fallback. Mark told me something I'll never forget. He said, I started praying before every meal, not because it was a habit, but because I wasn't sure where the next one would come from. And you know what? He never went hungry. Not once. Friends showed up. Churches helped, even strangers. He found part-time gigs, odd jobs, and little doors that opened just when he needed them. Nothing fancy, no big paycheck, but God showed up daily. Mark said, I used to think security came from money. Now I know. It comes from knowing I'm seen, and God sees me. That's what the widow's jar is about. Not comfort, not excess, but faith. Raw, real, day-by-day faith. Jesus later reminded us of this exact principle when He said, Give us this day our daily bread, not our monthly bread, not our rainy day bread, just today's. Because if we got everything we wanted up front, we'd stop talking to Him. But when we rely on Him daily, we stay close. We walk humbly. We listen more. We learn what trust really looks like. So if you're in a season right now where you're just trying to make it through the day, you're not failing. You're being formed, and trust me, sometimes the most powerful thing God can give you isn't a miracle you can post about. It's a jar that doesn't run out, so keep showing up. Keep trusting. Because what feels like barely enough might just be God's best work in your life. And just when everything seems to be stabilizing, when hope feels a little more steady, life throws another curveball. The widow's son collapses, and Elijah's journey takes an unexpected turn, one that will stretch his faith further than ever before. When faith is shaken, the first resurrection. 8. Unexpected tragedy. When faith faces death, things were finally looking up. The widow's pantry hadn't gone empty in weeks. Every day, just enough flour, just enough oil. She and her son were alive, not just surviving, thriving, in the middle of a national drought. And then it happened. Her son got sick, and he died. No warning, no chance to prepare, just silence. Can you imagine? She had trusted God. She had opened her home to a prophet. She had given when she had nothing left to give. And still, the worst happened. Her child, her whole world was gone. And in her pain, she turns to Elijah and says something raw, something honest. "Did you come here to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" That's not a lack of faith. That's heartbreak speaking. That's what it sounds like when your world falls apart and you have nowhere else to go. And maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been the one who believed, prayed, showed up, and still ended up burying someone you love, or watching your marriage collapse, or losing a dream you built your life on. Here's the hard truth. Faith doesn't mean pain won't hit you. It just means you won't face it alone. Some people think following God means having some kind of spiritual insurance policy, like, if I serve Him, He'll protect me from the hard stuff. But the Bible never promises that. It promises presence, not immunity. I once heard the story of a couple from Ohio, strong believers super involved in their church. One day they lost their daughter in a car accident. No explanation, just gone. And I'll never forget what the mom said at her daughter's funeral. "I don't understand this. I don't like this, but I still believe God is good, because if I don't hold on to Him now, I've got nothing left." That's real faith. And it's the kind of faith Elijah had to live out in that widow's home. He didn't have easy answers. He didn't tell her, "Don't worry, God's got this." No, he took the boy upstairs, laid him on the bed, and cried out to God. 3 times Elijah stretched himself over the boy. 3 times he prayed, desperate, broken, begging, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And then God did something that had never been done before. He brought the boy back. The child's soul returned. He started breathing again. Elijah picked him up, walked back down the stairs, and simply said, "Look, your son lives." It's one of the most powerful moments in Scripture, not because the miracle was flashy, but because it came from a place of raw grief and relentless trust. And listen, the miracle didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the loss, but it turned sorrow into a story. It turned tragedy into testimony. And maybe that's what God wants to do with yours too, because here's the truth that most people miss. Real faith doesn't protect you from heartbreak. It gives you strength to walk through it. God never said you wouldn't face loss, but He promised you'd never be alone in it. So if you're in a season right now where the tears come quicker than the words, if you're wondering where God is in the middle of your pain, remember this widow. She thought the story was over, but God was just getting started. Her house became the setting for the first recorded resurrection in the Bible, not in a palace, not in a temple, but in the quiet room of a grieving mother. That's who God is. He meets us in our lowest. He hears the cries we don't even know how to say. And He still brings life when everything feels lost. Next time, we'll see Elijah take everything he's learned, the pain, the trust, the fire, and step on to the biggest stage of his life. It's time for the showdown. Fire on the mountain, the battle of the gods. 9. The prayer of a broken prophet. When pleading becomes power. Let's go back to that quiet upstairs room. The widow's son is lying lifeless. Elijah is standing over him, not as a bold prophet, not as a man full of confidence, but as someone completely undone. This is Elijah, broken. He doesn't have answers. He doesn't have a plan. He only has one thing left. A cry. He picks up the boy's body, carries him upstairs, lays him down, and falls to his knees. And then he prays. Not once, not twice, 3 times. "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." There's no ceremony, no perfectly worded speech, just a desperate man asking God to do the impossible. You ever been there? You ever stood in a hospital room or sat alone in your car or laid awake at 2 a.m. and said, maybe out loud, maybe just in your soul, God, please, just do something? That's Elijah right here. And what I love about this moment is that God doesn't wait for Elijah to pray the right prayer. He doesn't demand perfect faith. He meets Elijah in the real, in the pain, in the pleading, in the raw human moment. You see, we often think the heroes of the Bible are different from us, like they never doubted, never cried, never broke down. But Elijah did. And this prayer, it wasn't powerful because it was eloquent. It was powerful because it was honest. Faith isn't always strong and steady. Sometimes faith is just showing up, even with your voice shaking, even when you don't know what to say. A few years ago, I heard the story of a dad in Tennessee. His toddler passed away unexpectedly. There were no answers, no warning, just a nightmare that became real. And at the funeral, he stood up and said something I'll never forget. I don't understand why, but I still trust God, not because everything makes sense, but because I can't face this without Him. That's what Elijah lived in this moment, and that's what some of you are living right now. You're carrying something that feels dead, a relationship, a dream, a part of your heart, and you don't even know if it's worth praying anymore. But hear this, faith isn't about never breaking down. It's about bringing your breakdown to God. Elijah prays again, then again, and on that third time, something shifts. The boy breathes. Life rushes back in. The impossible happens. Elijah picks him up, walks him down the stairs, and hands him to his mother. Look, he says, your son lives. The room that was filled with grief is now filled with awe. But here's what's important. This wasn't a reward for perfect faith. This was grace responding to a broken man who wouldn't stop asking, because God doesn't need polished people. He moves through those who are persistent. If you're in a season where all you can do is cry, where you're not even sure your prayers are getting through, don't give up. Sometimes the most powerful prayers are the ones soaked in tears. God sees you. He hears the messy, stumbling prayers that no one else does. And sometimes what looks like the end is just the setup for something miraculous. Elijah's not just a prophet anymore. He's a man who's wrestled with grief and seen God show up anyway. And now, it's time to bring that faith to the mountaintop. Because next, it's not just a prayer, it's fire. Stay with us for the next chapter, the showdown, Fire on the Mountain. 10. Resurrection and awakening. Faith that's proven. Imagine this. You're a single mom doing everything you can to survive. You've already buried hope once, and now you're holding your only son, and he's not breathing. And then, just when it seems like it's over, this prophet you barely know walks downstairs carrying your child in his arms and says softly, "Look, your son lives." That's exactly what happened to the widow Elijah stayed with, and it changed everything. See, she'd already seen miracles. She'd watched her flour and oil last way longer than it should have. She knew Elijah was different, but this was something else. This was personal. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about faith. Because when she looked at her son, alive again, she didn't just see life. She saw proof, and she said something powerful. "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Let that sink in. She didn't say, "Thanks for the miracle." She said, "Now I know." It took a moment of heartbreak, followed by a miracle, for her to move from hoping to knowing. And let's be honest, most of us get that. We've all had moments where we wanted to believe, but couldn't quite make the leap. Not until something happened that we couldn't explain. It's one thing to hear about God. It's another thing to experience Him. I remember hearing a story about a guy named Matt. He didn't grow up in church, didn't really think about God. Life was all about work, success, making money. But then one night, he gets a call. His daughter was in a wreck. It wasn't looking good. That night in the hospital, he dropped everything. And for the first time in years, he prayed. Simple, honest, scared. "God, if you're real, please save her." The doctors said it'd take a miracle, and she made it. A week later, she walked out of that hospital. And Matt, he didn't become some perfect religious guy overnight, but he told his friend, "That prayer? That changed something in me. Now I know He's real." That's the kind of shift this widow had. Her faith didn't come from a sermon or a philosophy. It came from a moment that was too real to ignore. Here's the thing. God doesn't always show up in lightning bolts or loud signs. Sometimes he shows up when breath returns to a body, when a situation you gave up on suddenly turns around, when you finally realize it wasn't chance, it was him. This is what makes faith real, not the stuff we repeat out of habit, but the belief that grows in the middle of heartbreak and healing. God could have convinced the widow with words, but he gave her something better. He gave her a son back. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there now. You're praying, waiting, wondering if God even sees you. And then, out of nowhere, something shifts. Something comes back to life, and you say what she said, "Now I know." So if you're still waiting, don't lose heart. Sometimes the miracle is closer than you think. Sometimes God lets everything fall apart so he can build something deeper than belief. Trust. Up next, Elijah goes from quiet miracles in a home to a showdown on the mountaintop, fire, crowds, and the true test of who really answers. Stay with us because the story is just getting started. Pay off. What this story means for you. Let's take a minute and look back at everything we've just walked through. We've seen a nation fall apart from the inside out. We've seen a man of God show up without a title, without a crowd, just obedience. We've watched a widow go from fear to faith, and a child go from death to life. And maybe the biggest takeaway is this: God is still working, even when it's quiet, even when it hurts, even when you feel like you've got nothing left to give. You don't need to be famous, rich, or have it all together to be used by God. You just need to show up, trust him, and take the next step, because just like Elijah, just like that widow, God does some of his greatest work in the most unexpected places with the most unlikely people. So let me ask you, what's your last jar of flour? That thing you think isn't enough. That part of your life you think God can't use. What if the thing you've been trying to protect is the very thing God wants to bless when you surrender it? Faith doesn't always look loud or flashy. Sometimes it's just waking up, showing up, and trusting him with today. That's where the miracles begin. If this message spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe to follow along this series. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that they're not forgotten. Drop a comment below and let us know. Which part of Elijah's journey hit home for you today? You never know who might read your story and find the courage to trust God again. We're just getting started. And next time, we're going from the quiet of the wilderness to the fire of Mount Carmel. See you there.